Hi, I'm Yana.
Hi, I'm Simon.
Welcome back to Rooted in Dirt HQ.
Today we're going to be talking about weighted vests. What's their use? What's the application for trail runners and ultra runners? And we're going to try and relate that back to progressive overload, which we spoke about last week. So if you haven't looked at that conversation yet, please go back to our YouTube channel and have a watch of that and a listen before you dive into this episode.
All right, so why are we talking about weighted vests? Now, I think we all came to hear about weighted vests potentially for the first time, or at least it sort of sprung back up onto our radar a couple of months ago when a big race, UTMB, took place. And both the men's and the women's winners, Tom Evans and Ruth Croft, are coached by the same coach. His name is Scott Johnston, and he incorporated weighted vest training and hiking into both of their training schedules leading up to the race. So, Simon, what is the reasoning? Why did Scott Johnston incorporate weighted vest training?
Yeah, so Scott Johnston, I think this year, the name got sort of popularized and he became more well known, but he's been coaching for a long time and has actually authored some books together with Killian Jornet on uphill training and the uphill athlete. So he's certainly, been sort of espousing this philosophy for a long time, and his philosophy for trail runners is to develop what he calls fatigue resistance. So when you talk about fatigue resistance, he's mostly focused on what I would call peripheral muscular fatigue resistance. So moving away from like the general metabolic demand and the physiology to what's the thing that's limiting ultra trail runners, particularly as the race lengthens, what's the thing that's slowing them down the most? And it seems to be this sort of muscle breakdown and fatigue and inflammation at the level of the actual skeletal muscle fibers themselves. So if I can develop their fatigue tolerance and delay that fatigue onset, then they should be moving quicker for longer. And so the way that he does this, and I'm sure there's a lot of other ways that one can do it, and I'm sure the philosophy is more nuanced than this, but one of the popular ways that he does it is by exposing his athletes to steep, really steep uphill running and or hiking in training. And then in the case of Tom Evans and Ruth Croft, and I think when you get like the further up the performance pillar you go, the more of a stimulus you need to get an adaptation. So that's when something like a weighted vest can come in to provide that additional load to the athlete.
Okay. So in deciding whether or not the weighted vest is a blanket recommendation or potentially a tool, just one of the tools in the training toolbox, I want to ask you a question. So there's this athlete, his name is Jim Walmsley.
Who's that?
I think most people would have heard about him. He, of course, is the GOAT. He holds many course records. He's been the GOAT for a long time. And he also, around the time that UTMB took place, he won shortly thereafter the long course at the World Mountain Trail Running Championships. And in a conversation that he had with Finn Melanson from Single Track, he shared that he had never, not once, trained with a weighted vest. So
yeah,
I'm assuming it's not a blanket recommendation, or what are your thoughts there?
No, it's not. Certainly not a blanket recommendation. Nothing is really. You get principles of training, I guess, but when it comes to using ergogenic aids like a weighted vest, I would say there's no blanket rule. Interestingly, with Jim, I think if you look at the trajectory of his career, he won a lot of races that maybe didn't involve as diverse of a mountain running skill set as UTMB first. So the more runnable races, which he absolutely dominated. And then really struggled at UTMB. before eventually succeeding. And, you'll see even with the very best athletes, Tom Evans this year, Ruth Croft, you name it, they all walk or hike at some point in the race. You cannot run for 100 miles with these steep uphill gradients. And so I think Jim will use weight. I'm going to say it right now. Jim will be using a weighted vest in training. He hasn't yet, but he will, much like he's evolved over the course of 10, 15, 20, whatever years of running. This will be something that I'm sure he will be looking to incorporate in his training. So, basically, I would suggest if you are training for a mountainous race, which has very, regular, steep uphill climbing sections, then you stand to benefit from using the weighted vest more so than if you're running a flatter, or downhill mountain race or whatever the case is. So if you've got regular steep sections, that's really good. And then I think in terms of like blanket recommendation, you've still got to keep trail running the main thing, and so Jim's philosophy, which I totally understand where he's coming from, is like, I'm not going to throw in a weighted vest if I can just do more mountainous running, run up a steeper slope or run on a longer mountain path. Like, why do I need to add on extra weight? And I think there is value in learning from that to say, you don't need to overcomplicate things. I would say if you haven't like maxed out on, getting the most mileage that you can in training and getting the most vert that you can in training safely, if you throw on a weighted vest on top of all of that, you might increase your risk of getting injured as well. So it's definitely something you want to manage and progressively introduce into training if you are going to compete in an event like UTMB or the World Mountain Long Course Championships, which is also super mountainous, super technical. So definitely not a blanket rule.
Okay, so you've got the options, right? So you've got the weighted vest, or you can increase both your mileage or your vertical gain. And only once you have increased your vertical gain and your mileage to the extent that can fit within your life, then you can consider, if we're thinking about how can we recommend to non-elites.
Not only them, because so basically what happens when you add a weighted vest on is you move slower, and you can still replicate the same metabolic demand. So if I'm running up a 15% slope, okay, and I'm running at whatever, I'm 10-minute miling, okay, my heart rate, again, throwing out numbers here, but my heart rate might be 150, okay, per minute, beats per minute. If I add on a weighted vest at 10% of my body mass, I'm going to have to run slower than 10-minute miles to reach the same metabolic load. So I can add on a weighted vest, slow my movement pattern or my movement demand to have the same metabolic load, but I actually spend more time then going uphill. So I think particularly for people who don't have access to long mountain climbs, steep mountain climbs, you can start to develop that sort of robust mechanical fatigue resilience using this vest. So while you may be trying to keep the metabolic load similar, you're now all of a sudden way increasing the mechanical load. So the amount of force, the amount of power you're having to produce is rising exponentially as you're adding more mass. And that leads to a whole bunch of sort of cell signaling, type 2 muscle fiber recruitment. Those muscle fibers then become more aerobically robust, so more fatigue resilient, because type 2 fibers are not very fatigue resilient. Now you're training them in a manner where they're having to do submaximal continuous repetitions, concentric contractions. So you're getting a lot of benefit by, even for your everyday athletes, by adding the load and just making your hills a little bit longer. Even if you just take away the metabolic side, just the muscle fatigue resilience side, because you've got more time. You're basically just increasing the time that you're spending going uphill. So there's definitely applications, I would say. But as you can tell, it's a nuanced conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that an athlete might ask, or something that would be important to touch upon, is that you spoke about load now. To what extent does the weighted vest also play a role in impact and forces? So, for example, if you have an athlete and they are quite at risk or prone to a niggle, or they're dealing with a niggle, you might say to them, let's get you on the uphill treadmill, let's get your heart rate up, because from an impact point of view, to do an uphill treadmill session could at least mitigate some of that risk, or that could play a role in sort of the cross training.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's so I know Tom Evans. I hope I get this right way around. I listened to a lot of. I was all in the Scott Johnston after UTMB. I was all over that. I think Tom spent a lot more time training indoors on treadmill than Ruth. So I think Ruth was more like, I want to be out in the mountains, and that sort of fills her cup up, whereas Tom is like, just machine.
Also makes sense. She's a Kiwi, he's a Brit. Her weather might be a little bit more conducive to.
Yeah, but I actually saw a lot of Tom's videos. He's got he's got a treadmill in his like little Suffer Dome cave thing, and doing like these sort of really steep hikes with poles, very forceful. So when it comes to adding the weighted vest, I think it lends itself really well to the treadmill, because basically what you can do is you can increase the concentric demand, so that the triple extensors, your calves, your quads, your glutes, the muscles that are serving to just shift your mass uphill, they're constantly engaged, you're moving uphill. And in terms of ground reaction forces, they do obviously go up if you add more mass, but you'd be surprised that it's not nearly as bad as like downhill running really fast. So I think you can sort of safely increase the load with uphill treadmill training. Your risk with doing this outside is like, once you get to the top, what do you do with your weighted vest? Once you get to the top of a steep mountain climb or mountain pass, 25% gradient for a kilometer or whatever, now you're stuck at the top with your vest. So I do think like logistically there are challenges, because if you then try and run down with that thing, you can put yourself at risk of sort of a repetitive overuse type injury. I'm more talking like, stress fractures and tendinopathies and, those sorts of...
never mind all of the chafe that you might get from poorly fitting weighted vests.
So I think there are definitely some risks that come into play when you are hauling that thing up and down. And I think a really, if you can, a good place to start to develop that resilience is to use it on the treadmill first. And then potentially you could start to say, right, I want to make this more real world. I want to get out into the mountains.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience?
I think so. The big, like, the question that came from the podcast, the Single Track podcast, was like, why add a weighted vest and do repeats if I can just Jim said, just add another col, add another mountain pass. So, I can run longer on the mountain pass, or someone might be thinking, can I not just go steeper? I regularly do 10 to 15% gradients in training. Why can't I just go to 20 or 25%? Won't it give me the same benefit as adding the weighted vest? And I think to an extent there's value in that. So both increasing the gradient and adding on a weighted vest in uphill running will do things like increase the amount of external work that you need to do, so power that you need to generate. It increases the ground contact time, so you're in contact with the ground for longer, so your muscles are under tension for longer. Muscles have to produce more force, and when you need to produce more force, you recruit type 2 muscle fibers, and we've already talked about that. all of these things are happening under both conditions. It also increases what's called the duty factor. So duty factor is like the proportion of time you spend in contact with the ground. So all of these things are happening, and I think that's a fair comment. But the one, as I've just mentioned, for those people who are struggling to get the long uphill climbs, is that's where the weighted vest can come into play. So, you have to sort of consider the utility, let's say, like why are you sort of, what situation do you find yourself in, and how can you stand to benefit? So the other thing to come into it is you can only increase gradients so much. Yeah. So I think you need to keep things specific. So someone might say, yeah, I can go to 20 or 25%. If you're going at 20 or 25% from your 10 to 15, you're probably starting to move into more of a walking gait anyway. Yeah. What happens when you go to 30%, 40%? You're going to max out eventually to a point where you are scrambling, and it becomes a very different, in fact, research by Minetti et al. 2002, fantastic paper, would suggest that like once you go past 15%, you're not really running anymore. This inertia of your legs and your arms that's actually helping to conserve energy as you run completely disappears. And so you're doing a lot more concentric work. The muscles are doing a lot more external work. So I think there's a limit to sort of how steep you can go in training realistically. You might be better served working in that 25 to 40% gradient, which is where you maximize vertical ascension speed, and adding load on top of that. I don't think it's just a case of I can keep going steep. I never need the weighted vest because I can just keep going steeper, or I can just keep going longer. I definitely think there's utility in adding the weighted vest.
Okay. I think just before we round off, I can imagine some of my athletes asking me, Jana, do I need to, if this is a route that I want to take, do I need to invest in a weighted vest specifically as a product? Can I add a couple of flasks to my pack? And also, I weigh, the ex-athlete weighs 50 kgs versus the athlete next to them weighing 75 kgs. Have you got any guidance as to percentage of body weight, or whether all weighted vests are created equal? Any thoughts there?
I like the Jim Walmsley philosophy actually, and I I don't want people to think I'm having a go at Jim. I like keeping things simple. Don't buy a weighted vest. I mean, we live in this consumerist world already. We buy enough stuff. You might already have a hydration vest, which you can load with, probably best to load it with fluid because there's a bit more, you don't want to put rocks in there. You're not David Goggins, but you can probably find other ways to add mass to your frame. It is about axial loading. So you do want it on your torso, I would suggest, or maybe around the waist, would be fine as well. You don't want it on your limbs. It's not gonna help you. The research that I've looked into, and I think is quite limited, is looked usually at 0, 5, and 10% of body mass. Okay. So those are the comparative groups. There are some nuanced differences, like leg stiffness is highest with 5% body mass, and leg stiffness is typically something that we seek to create as a stimulus or as an adaptation. I've heard of people going much heavier, 15%, 20% of body mass. So I definitely think you could probably look to explore that further. But if you were starting out, I would say 5 to 10% seems like a good range to start with. If you look at like military, army situations, they go way heavier than that, right? But obviously you're not having to lug that sort of stuff uphill. So you're looking to create enough of a stimulus to stimulate, the mTOR pathway signaling and PGC1 alpha, which results in the mitochondrial biogenesis in these type 2 fibers. You want enough of a stimulus. The type 2 fibers are being recruited, but you don't need to go way over the top, because then you increase the injury risk. So 5 to 10% maybe is a good starting point. I don't know if you can get that through water and clothes and stuff. Like we have someone engage with us, and we really appreciate those of you who do engage with us. on Instagram or on YouTube. I don't know if that's really sufficient. Like, oh, I've packed a liter or 2 liters of water, and if you weigh 60 kgs, then you know
that's not enough.
You're not there. Maybe you're approaching 5%, but you could, if you wanted to go then progressive overload, you would then need to add more stuff into your pack, or maybe eventually you get yourself a weighted vest. So I would not start by investing in a weighted vest. I would start by doing what I can. I also have heard, and this is maybe the benefit, is with some of those things you can drop stuff off at the top. So if you're doing water, for example, if you've got a place to fill your bottles, okay, fill your bladder, fill your bottles, fill your pack at the bottom, do your repeat, dump the stuff, come back down, fill it again, up you go, dump the stuff. So you can't really dump your weighted vest, you'll never see it again. so yeah, I think there's some other upshots to maybe looking to use or incorporate other things if you're in the real world in the mountains.
All right, well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We would love to hear from you. Have you ever used a weighted vest in training? Would you consider using one? If you have tried it before, did you have a positive experience or a negative experience? Please continue to engage with us on social media. Shoot us through any questions that you might have. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Cheers.